Chapter 7 The Witch's Sight.
The vermin will play out its part again, before and after. Now see the pond, skater, ignorant of anything above and below. Look to your own mind, ignorant of anything before and after.
Afternoon reluctantly dragged into early evening. Tallow watched the shadow of the pencil that he'd wedged into his inkwell gradually lengthen and move across the blank sheet of paper in front of him. When Master Balatro finally called the day's session to an end with a wave of his burnt and discoloured hat, the trio of young apprentices leapt from their seats, tucked their books and papers under their arms, and scampered out of the door and down the stairwell to awaiting homes and dormitories. Master Balatro started humming a ditty, as he always did, and wiped down the board with his sleeve. He always did this as well. Tallow tidied his papers and books, and resigned himself to the usual grappling match with his unforgiving desk. Many moments passed, moments of grunting, tilting, jarring and jolting, before he finally bettered his adversary, and staggered away, bruised and battered. Master Balatro was still pottering around, holding chalks up at eye level, and contemplating the paramount issues that arise within the walls of the city's only Academy of Sorcery, whether to reuse them tomorrow. Tallow grunted something resembling a goodbye, ducked his head under the low door frame, and trudged down the stairwell to the ground floor. About 4 or 5 strides along the street from the entrance to the tower, Tallow grinned to himself, exposing teeth as long as and even as organ pipes, and hurried his walk. A plan was already hatched. He pulled his hood over his head, reached into his robe, and felt for the key. Its touch was pleasantly reassuring. With a skip in his step, he headed towards the poorer parts of the city. Moving first away from the safe, clean area of the academy, Tallow had traversed the district known as 3 Trees by locals. Not so long ago, this area had witnessed the hangings of those convicted of murder, counterfeiting, and treason. A drumroll would fill the square. A lever would be pulled, and the stage would open. From 3 very tall, upright wooden beams, the guilty would pitch, drop, and jerk like a string puppet made to dance by a boisterous child. The gallows were gone now, although the horizontal beams remained in almost the same spot. They had been built into the ceiling timbers of a tavern, aptly named the Hangman's Daughter. Every night, the unsavoury patrons that drank here would raise their mugs to the 3 worn grooves in the timbers. Tallow passed before this tavern, just as a toast was being called to those that had tasted the rope. This was soon followed by jeering, cheering, and loud, raucous laughter. Head down, Tallow neither noticed nor cared. Crossing a boundary only the locals could pinpoint, he strode into the district called Last Hold, where the cramped, hastily built wooden buildings, characteristic of this part of the city, became a warren. Parts of the prison that had once stood here still remained, a wall here, a building there, all muddled amongst the rickety, ramshackle houses that sprawled throughout the area. As he took a left into an alley, a group of 3 men emerged from the darkness and moved deliberately into Tallow's path. Head still down, his face hidden by the gloom of his hood, he stopped and swished his robe, exposing the hexagram motif embroidered into the folds beneath. The first man gasped, cursed, and backpedaled into his 2 companions. Like wheat before a scythe, the men parted, making a sign of the protective hammer. This sign belonged to the deity Aralupus, a deity whose Templars would travel far and wide with strong words and stronger arms, and vanquish all those that dabble in the black arts. Tallow strode past, allowing a smile to pass across his hidden face. He muttered to himself. The next district was easily Tallow's least favourite of this or in any city. It was known as Squealers, and it contained most of the city's numerous slaughterhouses. He held his sleeve tightly over his mouth and nose in an attempt to block the stench of manure and blood that saturated the air. But after a minute or so of breathing shallowly, he stumbled on the grime and sludge that covered the street like melted wax, inhaled sharply, gagged, and choked. Several thin ragamuffins broke their play and watched as the tall, robed figure, leaning against a wall, contributed to the filth in the street with the contents of his stomach. Tallow soon noticed them staring. He cursed aloud and snarled at the nearest child, her clothing and skin the colour of the street. She dropped the straw dolly she was carrying and darted away with the others, their bare feet spraying up mud and blood from the filth that lay underfoot. Tallow took a rose-scented handkerchief from his robe, wiped his mouth, and stumbled on, kicking the dolly aside. 2 more city districts later, and his mood started to lighten, and by the time he eventually reached his destination, a small market in the district of Crow's Call, the faint trace of a smile lingered on his lips. He waited on the outskirts of the market, raised his hood very slightly, and peered out at the few remaining hawkers and stall owners still in the square. With both daylight and the opportunity for sales fading fast, the calls from the market were fast losing their enthusiasm and were quickly sinking to desperation. Abandoning their pitches, sellers now followed potential buyers like ducklings behind their mothers. Urchins, children born of the street, moved in looking for an opportunity to snatch something, anything, from the unmanned stalls. Tallow remained on the fringe of the market square, scanning for the object of his search, a flower seller. And through milling buyers, pestering stall owners, and darting urchins, he spotted her. She stood before the vast, dark and foreboding carved oak doors of the grand, many-pillared building that, in a previous life, had been the magistrate's court. He grinned and pictured the magistrates in their long black coats, faces pressed against the windows, leering down disapprovingly at the criminals peddling their illegal wares under their very noses. But now, only the faces of children pressed against the glass. Children forced into working large and dangerous machines for a successful cloth merchant. Occasionally bosses could be seen walking past, swishing canes and sending the children scampering away from the windows and back to their bone-breaking looms. Tallow's daydreaming was broken by the emergence of a short, round-shouldered fellow with enormous sideburns and a shirt that looked to have been dragged through a gutter, and back again, and once more just for fun.
"Pigs, trotters, tails, or melt, my lord?"
the fellow half asked, half pleaded. Tallow looked down at the crate of various pig body parts in disgust and waved the butcher aside. The fellow hesitated for a second before moving away, his eye drawn by either the white of Tallow's hand, the markings on his robe, or both. Tallow cared not, and flicked his gaze back to where the flower seller had been standing. She was gone. Her bright green stockings and a cheap red dress, all puffed up with layers of frayed lace, were nowhere to be seen. Tallow cursed, and his nostrils flared. The smell of the poor end of the city was beginning to irritate him. He whirled about face, eager to be back in his clean, pleasant room. And there she was, stood barely a yard in front of him. He yelped and threw up his arms in surprise.
"Damn you, Rosa!"
Tallow hissed through his buck teeth. A smile might have crossed her lips, but it left as quickly as it came, if it came at all. Tallow regained his composure, straightened his robes and hid his hands back in his long sleeves. Rosa continued to stare, unmoving at Tallow's face. Tallow raised an eyebrow, jutted his head forward, and stared back. After their gazes had remained locked for a few seconds, Tallow blinked and muttered a tad timidly,
"Careful, someone doesn't see us."
Rosa let a smile linger this time. Tallow sucked his teeth and looked about nervously for eavesdroppers. He then noticed that the fog that always appeared nightly in the poorer areas of the city was starting to materialize. This was a fog of sweat, steam and tears, and smelt of decay and blood. The fog, Tallow noticed, seemed particularly thick around Rosa and himself. In fact, great swirls were subtly being drawn from the surrounding air to form a rotating ring about them, a ring so dense that neither could he see out, nor could anyone see in. Rosa casually reached into his hidden pocket and pulled out the key. She moved the key between her fingers, never taking her eyes from Tallow's. She then clenched the key in one hand and held the other, palm up, in front of Tallow. He deftly retrieved 2 silver coins from a pouch beneath his robe and placed them in her hand.
One will do.
She said tartly. Tallow continued to press both into her palm.
So be it.
She whispered. She closed her fingers around the coins and dropped her basket to the floor. Her flowers scattered amongst the puddles, plum stones, cherry stems, and boiled knuckles, the usual litter found on the floor of this market at the close of the day's business. She crouched as if to pick them up. Tallow did likewise and held his silence. A moment later, a chill emerged, causing his breath to appear as wisp-like spectres in the gloom. Even the nearby conversations and padding of footsteps became muffled and distant as the witch worked her magic. From her mouth came a chant of whispers, the words guttural and alien. With the key clutched in one hand, she waved her other over a puddle barely the size of a saucer. An image appeared on its surface. Tallow held his breath, leant forward, and focused on the image. He could make out Master Belatro and another figure, a short, rounded man. He was so rounded, in fact, that he was almost a ball. This stranger wore a mustard-coloured waistcoat and had a hood drawn over his head. This obscured most of his face. Behind the 2 of them, Tallow discerned the familiar rounded walls and counter of the ground floor of the Sorcery Academy. The portly stranger pulled his hood up away from his face, a face as round as a plate. He had dabbed rouge on his cheeks, applied a shadow under his first chin, hoping to disguise his other 3, and drawn what looked like a small red butterfly on his lips. He looked ridiculous. He began to speak, yet the voice came not from the image on the puddle. It came from Rosa.
I risk too much coming here.
The voice was rather whiny and stuffy. Rosa's voice then changed to that of Master Belatro's.
Bother yourself not. No, many people, just from curiosity, visit here. I have quite a collection.
Well, let's make this as quick as we can.
The stuffy voice cut in. The stout fellow reached down to his side and lifted up a case that may have contained a tall hat or a deep vase. This he handed to Belatro, using what seemed an unnecessary amount of care. Belatro giggled, kissed the case, and then ran his tongue across his lips with a saurian flicker of greedy delight. Tallow was startled by this most unusual reaction from his doddery old master. He leant closer and strained to see if he could discern any more detail about the identity of this mysterious package. But the image was too small, and it started to flicker and shimmer. He scowled and snapped his head up to look at Rosa. His expression quickly softened from agitation to concern when he saw that her face was etched with effort and her breathing short and sharp. She flashed Tallow a quick smile of reassurance and gestured with her eyes for him to look back at the image. The scene had moved on. Tallow could now see the man leaving the academy and Belatro climbing the stairwell, past the first story, the classroom, and up again into his living quarters. The old master lit a lantern and set the tall case on a table. Leaning forward, and with a hint of something mischievous and altogether sinister in his expression, he wiggled his fingers and unlatched the lid. He first peered down into the case, and from Rosa's throat came a giggle. His giggle. Tallow had never heard a sorcerer mastery giggle. It didn't sound right. It didn't sound like a giggle that should have come from a stuffy, bumbling old dodderer. But it did. Belatro then took a step back, blew on his fingers, waited a moment, then carefully, slowly, he reached forward and eased something up and out of the case. It was a vase. No, more like a jar. Once he had set this down on the table next to the case, he stepped back once more. Another moment passed before he leaned forward and tapped the jar with a finger. Nothing happened. The scene shimmered again. Tallow kept his head lowered, but raised his eyes to look at Rosa. As always, he saw that she wore a fine white powder on her face, but it did very little to remove the lines of hardship that marred her otherwise pretty looks. Her hair was mostly black, with a trace of silver at the temples. To Tallow she looked like a china doll, petite and vulnerable, with large, unblinking eyes that merely reflected life around her, rather than provide a window to her soul. Tallow's musing was then abruptly broken by the sound of Bellatro's voice coming from Rosa's mouth once more.
Pom, 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 malachite and azurite, pom, 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 peridot and hematite.
The puddle now showed Bellatro waving his silver key around in time with his ditty. In his other hand he held a lantern, and under the arm, the case. He was taking the stairwell up to the top story of the tower. All the while, Rosa continued to sing in his voice.
Moonstone and opal, emerald and spinel.
The stairwell stopped at the foot of a steel door. The steel door. This was apparently enchanted to resist all attempts at entry, as were the walls, ceiling and floor of the ultimate and top story of the tower. Tallow recalled the demise of Lucy Pinder. The master had a passion for limericks.
Heed the tale of little Lucy Pinder. In less than a second burned to a cinder. Touch the door. She do that no more. Now she's nothing more than tinder.
Then there was Tommy Trout.
Heed the tale of silly Tommy Trout. He managed just to whimper, not even a shout. Touch the door, he'd do that no more. He was promptly turned inside out.
Tallow recalled the graphic details Master Bellatro delved into regarding Tommy's fate and his exposed innards. And then there was moribund Caltrop. He tried a spell of opening on the door, and as a result, the poor boy Caltrop, well, this is what the master had sang with a hint of menace and a touch of glee.
Heed the tale of moribund Caltrop. Tried a spell and couldn't stop. When his brain had sizzled, smoke and fizzled, and only ceased when his eyes went pop.
Tallow was unconvinced of the truth of these tales of woe. The younger students were convinced. They had visibly recoiled at the master's lurid description, and shared a pallor with the green of the master's chalks. Bellatro briefly ceased his singing, dropped the key in a pocket, and with his spare hand rummaged around in his robe for something else. This something he held clenched in his palm. Tallow judged that this something must be a key of sorts, the only means to open the enchanted door. Maybe there was truth in the tales. Just maybe. Holding the something aloft, the master grinned and popped it into his mouth. It was nothing more than a toffee humbug, the master's favourite. Tallow scowled, angry at himself for believing, albeit briefly, in Bellatro's silly rhymes. His mouth now full, the master quickly muttered some words. Tallow turned his head to Rosa, straining to hear them, but all he heard was the master's usual mumbling. He did notice, however, that Rosa's voice could be heard alongside the master's, but hers was barely a whisper. Now this begged the question of just how Rosa could speak with two voices at the same time. Tallow put the question to the back of his mind, and peered back to the scene on the puddle. The master peered suspiciously over his shoulder, waved his hand before the door, and announced,
Open, says me.
He chuckled. The door swung open. Bellatro sucked noisily on his humbug and stepped in. Tallow screwed up his face in disbelief. He then frowned. He reasoned that there must be more to opening the door than this childish cantrip. He parked this oddity also in the back of his mind, and went down closer to the puddle, his face now just inches away. Within this mysterious top story he could see rods, wands, staves, helmets, a breastplate supported by a frame, and several cloaks on a coat stand. And all about the walls were tapestries. Bellatro put his lantern and the case on a low wooden table. On this table was a small steel chest. He picked up the chest and continued his song whilst chewing and slurping.
Bloodstone red and a pearl of snowy white, The darkest king of Alexandria.
Balatro turned the chest upside down, ran his hands over its base, smiled and retrieved the silver key from his pocket. Tallow ahed in anticipation. The master inserted the key in a lock on the underside of the chest and carefully turned it before taking the key out and replacing the chest back on the table. He flicked the lid open. Tallow started to grin. The mystery of the silver key would soon be revealed. The old sorcery tutor started to take many multicoloured, precious-looking stones as small as pebbles from the inside of the chest. He held them in turn before his face, spitting on each and then wiping it on the sleeves of his robe. Tallow huffed and blew out a raspberry. This was an anticlimax. He wanted to see something marvellous and exciting, failing that something sinister, failing that something at least moderately interesting. Instead, all he witnessed was his old nemesis handling nothing more than a boring, inconsequential jar, and then playing with a handful of agates. He moved his focus away from Balatro, still singing and admiring his precious stones, to that of the tapestries on the wall behind. Tallow thought,
Why would the master hang tapestries in his room?
it was scruffy. In fact, the master redefined scruffy. His purple robe was purple no longer. It was faded, burnt, and blotchy with chalk. His beard was unkempt, and like the rest of him, covered in chalk. Even his face and hands looked to have been deprived of soap for a decade or two. So Tallow continued to reason.
And why would the master cover the room in tapestries that no one would see?
Tallow parked this with the other two unanswered questions for rumination later. He turned his full attention back to the scene. The tapestry immediately past Balatro's left shoulder depicted a windmill, the glory of its bright colours now dulled with age. Tallow turned and twisted his head over the puddle, trying to catch a glimpse of any of the others. Balatro's voice then started to drift off, and the image began to fade. Tallow grunted in surprise and jerked his head up to look at Rosa. She met his eye, frowned, waved her hand over the puddle, and resumed the spell. Tallow noticed again that when she wasn't speaking with another's voice, she was chanting strange words just under her breath. Balatro was gone. The lantern remained on the table. The chest was now closed. The silver key was lying next to it. The jar was also gone. Tallow looked up at Rosa, somewhat surprised. She simply used her eyes once again to direct his gaze back to the image, maintaining her strange chant as she did so. The fog continued to orbit the pair, keeping their activities guarded. Nothing was happening. Nothing had moved. Nothing was moving save the lazy flicker of the lantern. Tallow kept watching. Shortly afterwards, the sound of Rosa's chant gave way to the voice of Balatro.
Purple is its golden green, pale is blue aquamarine.
Tallow peered intensely at the image, but the room was still unoccupied. Then, as suddenly as he had disappeared, Balatro was there once more. Footsteps approached the pair. Rosa fell silent. The image faded, and she started to gather her fallen flowers. Tallow chewed on his lower lip, mulling over the images he had just witnessed. He slowly stood up from his kneeling position. One of his knees clicked in protest. Rosa remained in a crouch, keeping her head bowed and her face hidden, waiting for the sound of the footsteps to fade away. Tallow mumbled something that he knew Rosa couldn't hear before spinning about face and striding away. At the edge of the market square he stopped, looked over his shoulder, and saw her through the thinning fog, patting down her threadbare, tatty red dress. He sighed and returned back to his home, taking a longer route to avoid the horrors of squealers. Tallow was first into the classroom the following morning. As he strolled in, he looked down at the floor under the blackboard, grinning as he saw the usual mixture of coloured mounds of chalk stubs and powder. With sleight of hand worthy of a sideshow conjurer, the silver key found itself from his robe to his palm and down his robe to land atop his soft leather boot. With a petulant flick of his ankle, the key skidded across the floor into the stubs. As it came to rest, the only evidence of his subterfuge was a puff of chalk powder.